Chapter 7, Section 2. Andrew Johnson begins presidential reconstruction. The queerest character that ever occupied the White House. That is how one observer described Andrew Johnson. Certainly, Johnson's path to the presidency was unusual. When the war broke out, Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. Even though his state seceded, he kept his Senate seat, the only senator from the southern state to do so. A lifelong Democrat, Johnson was nonetheless nominated by Republicans to run for vice president in 1864. True to his party roots, Johnson saw himself as a champion of the common man. But though he condemned former slaveholders as a pampered, bloated, corrupted aristocracy, he had little concern for former slaves. They would have no role in his plans for reconstructing the South. Johnson's Reconstruction Plan, a smooth return for southern states. Fewer than 2 months after taking office, Johnson announced his Reconstruction Plan. A former Confederate state could rejoin the Union once it had written a new state constitution, elected a new state government, and repealed its Act of Secession, canceled its war debts, and ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The first three Reconstruction-era amendments, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Republicans in Congress urged Johnson to add a requirement that southern states must grant freedmen the right to vote. Johnson, however, resisted their pleas. White men alone, he insisted, must manage the South. Former slaves test their new freedom. As presidential reconstruction got underway, former slaves were testing the meaning of freedom. For many, it meant freedom to travel. Before emancipation, slaves could not leave their homes without a travel pass from their masters. Now they took to the road, often in search of loved ones who had been sold in slavery times. For others, freedom meant the right to wed, knowing that the marriage was not only legal, but could also last until death do us part. Weddings, just now, are very popular and abundant among the colored people, wrote an Army chaplain. I have married during the month 25 couples, mostly those who have families and have been living together for years. Freedom also meant the right to pursue something else long denied to slaves, an education. Freedmen flocked to schools set up by various groups. Booker T. Washington, a freedman who became a leading educator, observed, "It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. As fast as any kind of teachers could be secured, not only were days schools filled, but night schools as well. The great ambition of the older people was to try to learn to read the Bible before they died." Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, an Autobiography, 1901. Along with education, freedmen were desperate to acquire land to farm. During the war, Congress Thaddeus Stevens had advocated breaking up southern plantations to give freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, in return for their years of unpaid labor. "We have turned, or are about to turn, loose 4 million slaves without a hut to shelter them or a cent in their pockets," he argued. "If we do not furnish them with homesteads, we had better have left them in bondage." Congress, however, refused to implement Stevens' plan, arguing that to take planters' land without payment would violate their property rights. Before the end of the war, the Union government had established the Freedmen's Bureau to assist former slaves and poor whites living in the South. The Bureau provided food, clothing, education, and medical care. It also gave legal assistance to former slaves and acted as a court of law in some situations. But its attempts to solve the problems of farmland for freedmen were thwarted by Johnson, who pardoned former Confederates and returned the land to them. Black codes restrict the freedom of former slaves. As new Southern governments were formed, Johnson withdrew Union troops in the South. Many Northerners did not share Johnson's willingness to let the South reconstruct itself. Congressman Benjamin Flanders warned of former Confederate leaders. Their whole thought and time will be given to plans for getting things back as near to slavery as possible. Sadly, Flanders was right. Across the South, state legislatures passed black codes, laws intended to restrict the freedom and opportunities of African Americans. The Black Code served three purposes. The first was to spell out the rights of African Americans. They could own property, work for wages, marry, and file lawsuits. But other civil rights or rights of citizenship, such as the right to vote or serve on juries, were denied them. The second purpose was to ensure a workforce for planters who had lost their slaves. The codes required freedmen to sign yearly labor contracts each January. Those who did not could be arrested and sent to work for a planter. The final purpose of the Black Codes was to maintain a social order in the South that limited the upward mobility of African Americans. The codes barred blacks from any jobs but farm work and unskilled labor, making it impossible for them to rise economically or to start their own businesses. Such restrictions led a Northern journalist touring the South to write, The whites seem wholly unable to comprehend that freedom for the Negro means the same thing as freedom for them. They readily enough admit that the government has made him free, but appear to believe that they still have the right to exercise over him the same old control. Sidney Andrews, Atlantic Monthly, 1866.